Hello everyone, this is your friend SG and this is the sixth part of the React interview ready series where we are covering the interview questions regarding React. Okay, so if you haven't watched the previous parts where we completed React hooks, JSX, lifecycle methods, DOM and virtual DOM and other concepts, go check out those videos first and then start from here. Okay, in this video we'll be covering all the concepts of components, functional class components, controlled and uncontrolled, and all other different types of components. Okay, all the questions regarding components we'll be covering in this part only. So let's just begin the video. So the very first question is, what are components in React? So a component is considered as the core building block of the React application. So if you are familiar with React, then you are also familiar with the concept of component. Okay, so components are simple reusable parts of the React code. Okay, so if we see in this example, this lorem ipsum, this title, it's a component, this search bar is a separate component, and in the main body there are several different components as well. Okay, so components are the reusable part. We code them once and we can reuse them again and again inside the entire application. If we consider an example of a button, let's say, okay, so in the entire application we'll be using a button several times. So instead of writing its style, its functions and its body each time, we'll be writing it once and we'll be calling it in the entire application wherever we need. Okay, so this reduces our code and the working is more efficient and faster. Okay, so they let us break the user interface into separate pieces that can be reused and handled separately. They serve the same purpose as JavaScript functions. Okay, they are similar to JavaScript functions. We write the functions once and call them separately each time we need them, but work in isolation and return HTML code via the render method. Okay, a JavaScript function, it returns a single value or an object, whereas the a React component returns a HTML code. Okay, to be displayed. In the case of button only, it returns the entire code of the button. Components are of two types: class components and the functional components. We'll be discussing them just in a minute. Each component exists in same space, but they work independently from one another and could be merged all in the parent component. Okay, in the very first video we saw that different components are in React are merged together without affecting different another one's code. Okay, if 5 persons are working on the same code, then they could write different components and they could be merged without affecting anyone other's code. So this is the main feature of React, the components. Okay, different people write different components and those components are merged in future without affecting anyone else's code. Okay, so the next question is, differentiate between the functional and the class components. Let's see. Functional components. A functional component is just a plain JavaScript function that accepts props as an argument and returns a React element, whereas a class component requires to be extended from React.component. Okay, it is a class, so it is required to extend it from the React.component and we create a render function which returns a React element. Okay, inside a class component the render method is required. The render method is the one that returns the HTML code, the React element code. Okay, in the functional component there is no render method, whereas in the class components render method is required. In a functional component, these are also known as stateless components. We know that initially the functional components didn't have the functionality of state, so they were also called as stateless component. But after the introduction of hooks, the useState hook was introduced and now they also use the state, but still they are called the stateless components. Okay, whereas class components, they are called as stateful components. React lifecycle methods cannot be used inside functional components, but hooks can be used. Whereas in a class components, hooks cannot be used, only lifecycle methods are allowed. Next question is, differentiate between controlled and uncontrolled components. So what are controlled components? Controlled components do not maintain their internal state, whereas uncontrolled components, they maintain their own internal state. In the control components, data is controlled by the parent because they are not maintaining their state. So the parent is the one that maintains, that controls the data via props. Whereas in the uncontrolled components, data is controlled by the DOM itself. In the control components, they accept their current value as prop by the parent. Whereas in the uncontrolled components, they get their current value via the references, useref. In the control components, they allow data validation control, whereas in the uncontrolled components, they do not allow validation control. And in the control components, they have better control over form elements and data, but in the uncontrolled components, they are not very much efficient in controlling the form data and elements. Okay, form elements and the data. The next question is differentiate between stateful and stateless components. So what are those? Stateful components are class components, we saw, and the stateless components could be functional or class components. Now we know that the stateless components are the functional components, but if a class component also doesn't have a state, then this could also be regarded as a stateless component. As the name suggests, stateless, a component that doesn't have a state. So a class component not having a state could also be regarded as stateless. Stateful, they have a state that gets initialized in the constructor, whereas in the stateless, these components do not have a state. This keyword is used for binding and to access the state in stateful components. We saw that in a class component, we need this keyword, but in stateless component, this keyword is not needed. In a stateful component, set state is used to update the state because they are class components. So this dot set state will be used. In stateless component, there is no state, so set state is also not used. In the stateful components, lifecycle methods can be used because they are class components, whereas generally in a stateless component, hooks are used because we generally consider that stateless components are the functional components. So React hooks are used inside stateless components. So now comes the question. We saw stateful components, stateless components. We saw class and functional components. Now comes the question that when can we use class component over a functional component? So initially, in the initial version of React, if we wanted to write a component that has to manage its state, then class component can be used because initially functional component didn't have the functionality of state. But with later versions of React, hooks were introduced, and so now we can use state in functional components as class as well. So both functional and class components could be used simultaneously because now both of them almost provide us the similar features. But there are some exceptions to functional components. If we need to use error boundaries, since there isn't a functional version of this yet, so if we want to use error boundaries, we have to go with the class components only. Okay, what are error boundaries? We will be discussing in future videos. Okay, so for now, only understand that if we want to use the concept of error boundaries, then we have to use class components only, because at least for now, when I am creating this video, till now there is no scope of using error boundaries in the functional components. Okay, but still it is always recommended to use a functional component though, because with the help of hooks, all functionalities can be performed inside a functional component only, and a little bit of less code also needs to be rewritten because this keyword is omitted, render is not needed, and a lot of other things as well that are not needed in functional component. So code is also reduced a bit. That's why it is recommended to use functional component, but there is no as such obligation that you cannot use a class component or any other stuff. Okay, yeah. So next question comes, can we force update a component without calling set state? Let's see. Yes, we can do that. We can force update a component without calling set state. We know that once set state is called, state is updated, the component is re-rendered again. But can we do that without set state? Yes. React component can be force updated without calling set state. This could be done by calling this.forceUpdate method in the class component. Okay. So inside a class component, we have a function called this.forceUpdate. So calling this method, calling this function, the entire component will be re-rendered again. But there is an obligation to that. Calling force update will cause the render to be called on the component, but this will skip the should component update. Okay, so if we are trying to make some checks in the should component update function lifecycle method, then those checks will be omitted. Anyhow, what are the conditions? It won't check. It will directly force update and render the component. Okay, skipping the should component update. But all the lifecycle methods of the child components of each of its child component will be called in the same manner, including should component update. Okay, the should component update for that current component will be omitted, but it will be called for its separate child components. Okay, for all the child components, all the lifecycle methods will be called in the same manner only. So it's better to use functional components and use hooks, prop, state, and context and other things to re-render instead of using force update, because it will skip the should component update. Okay, and if the rendering is not needed, it will still re-render the component. Okay, so keep this thing in mind that force update shouldn't be used, but still you should know that there is a way to force update the component, to force re-render the component. So next question is, what are pure components in React? Pure component are the class components that extend React.pureComponent. In this video only we saw that the class components extend React.component. Okay, so there is also another way of creating the classes. We can extend them from React.pureComponent. Okay, what is the difference between them? Let's see. If we extend a class with React.pureComponent, there is no need for should_component_update lifecycle method. What this lifecycle method does, it will conditionally render or re-render the entire component. Okay, so this is a lifecycle method that needs to be defined by us. If we haven't defined this lifecycle method, then React will re-render the component each time if there are some state or any state change, and it will re-render the component again. But inside, if we are extending the component from React.pure class, then we don't need to use should_component_update. The components that are extended from pure component, they by default have the implementation of should_component_update. So after each state update, they will check the value of props and the state. They'll compare the state and prop values, initial and the final values, and the component will itself decide that whether re-rendering is needed or not. We don't need to manually do this thing. Okay, so what it will do, it will make the application faster and ensure the higher performance of the component. So this is what React.pureComponent does. It omits the use of should_component_update and it performs this thing by default. By default, this should_component_update functionality is implemented in them. So the next question is, what are higher order components? A higher order component is a function that takes a component and returns a new component. We have seen that a function takes an argument and returns a single value or an object. But a higher order component, it is also a function that takes input of a component and returns a component as well. Okay, a component transforms props into the UI, whereas a higher order component transforms a component into another component. Some of the very common examples of higher order components are connect in Redux and create fragment container in Relay. Okay, so the syntax of this is, we'll pass the name of the higher order component and we'll pass another component as an argument and it will return another component. So here enhanced component. So this enhanced component will be the new component that we'll get, and we are passing the wrapped component. This is a component that we are passing inside the higher order component. Okay, so these are very commonly used higher order components. If you have worked with Redux, then you might have used connect. So this is very commonly used in Redux. Okay, so we'll be covering Redux in future videos, but for now only understand that connect is a higher order component in Redux. Yeah, so this is it for this video, and if you have any doubts, you can ask me in the comments, and for the to access all the questions in the sheet, you can check out the sheet link in the description as well. Okay, so this is it. Thank you. Tata, bye bye.